Before we begin, there's a little preparation I want you to make so that we can do this the way I envision it happening. And that is, one, I want you to make sure that you have a pencil or a pen in your hand so that when I say things that really tick you off, you'll be able to write it down on your piece of paper. And so later, I have a few here. So later, when we move into a time when we can actually have a conversation, you can look at your notes and you'll remember what it is that you wanted to say to me when you heard me say that. I know that sometimes when you see people in conversations on talk shows and horrible things are being said, you wonder why they don't get up and leave. It's because they're wired to either the chair or the table that they're sitting at, and if they tried to get up to leave, I know this personally, if you tried to get up and leave, you'd take the table with you, and it would be horribly humiliating. So people have to stick around. But I want you, once you've got the pencil in hand, I want you to be aware of where your coat is, so that if you want to get up and leave, you can do so. It's happened before. And if you know where your coat is, it can happen with as much grace as you'll possibly be able to muster.
Is this part of being a radical secularist that you accused of on Tuesday?
Oh, no. I've been called such worse things than that. No, but it's about this week, and it's about this world, and it's about the conversations that we need to have, and it's about the difficulty that it is to have those conversations. When I chose the passage that Ruth shared with you and had to give Scott a snippet of what the service was going to be about so that he could choose music, it's always sort of a tense moment when I share that with Scott, because the look on his face is always, how on earth do you think that that's going to be of interest to anyone? Because it's never, when I give it to him, it's way early in the week and I haven't thought my way through it, and it's just kind of like this smidgen of an idea. But the smidgen of the idea was that in this season, before Christmas, John the Baptist gives out all these warnings about what is going to happen to the world. And he's a prophet that lives out in the desert. And do you know why prophets lived in the desert? Because people hated them. They couldn't stand a thing that they said. And so they had to live way away from other people. They stank. They were just not cared for because they didn't care about themselves. They cared about what they were saying. And so John the Baptist, this stinky, mouthy guy, was out in the desert, and people were flocking to him to find out what was going to happen because they felt that the end of the world was at hand, and they did not want to be destroyed. And he gives them, in this version in Luke, a list of things that they can do to prepare for the end of the world. And I said to Scott that my sermon was going to be about hope. I mean, after all, that's the week in the Advent readings. This is the week about hope. And how our hope in our previous worldview was contained within the idea that there would come a day when everything would be set right by that divine being who looked over and cared for all of us, counted up our mistakes, watched the positive things that we did, tallied it up, and would, in the end, make things right. And so we answered John the Baptist's cry and all the cries that have come subsequently from similar prophets, loved and hated. Our response was one that was based in fear, based in that belief that we would somehow end up on the wrong side of the ledger, and our lives beyond this earthly one, which I believe is the only one we have, but if our lives were to live on beyond this, they would be lived out exclusively in torment. And so I said to Scott, I'm going to talk about how even without that big guy mad at us, we have to live like that. So it'll be hope and love and compassion, which is basically what we talk about every week. But then the week happened, and the world shifted the way it shifts every moment of the day. Someone's life slides into tragedy, and doesn't slip the way that we want it to slip into hope. Traditionally, in my tradition, a Christian tradition, the place of evil, the reality of evil, the existence of evil in the world is one that is much discussed. Because I would have difficulty if I believed in a benevolent God, a ruler of the universe who knows everything that will happen, and I were to not find some way to justify that God's presence in the face of overwhelming evil. And that conversation has gone on for centuries, millennia. How if we have belief in an all-powerful, all-benevolent being, how can suffering exist? It's a fairly recent addition to the idea of gods. Most of the earlier gods, Greek and Roman gods that we study, had their faults, every one of them. But our God was supposed to be this perfect God. And so if I was going to make that jibe with all this horrible stuff that happened in the world, I better come up with a big word to explain it. And theodicy is the word that was coined many centuries into the conversation. Theodicy is about the existence of suffering in the world and how it can be real up and against a God that too was understood as real. Now, you might say, well, Gretta, you don't believe in that God, so what's with the theodicy sermon this morning? And the theodicy sermon is that the questions are still significantly important, and we don't get to just wash our hands of them and walk away because we don't believe in that God. It doesn't give us a pass on that struggle with evil and suffering and how we can address it, respond to it in our lives. And so I'm going to set up 3 pictures and then explore the concept of theodicy through those 3 pictures. The first picture is one that isn't getting a whole lot of press right now. 3 or 4 days ago, there were a number of articles about it on the net, but if you do a search now, nothing fresher than that comes up, except something that might come up on pages of the Aboriginal community. And that's the reality that Ruth shared with you, that Chief Teresa Spence is on a hunger strike on Parliament Hill. And she's not there because she has a personal bone to pick. She's there because her peoples have been denigrated and oppressed and denied rights and treated like scum for centuries. And we, Ruth spoke of us as treaty people, we who are on half of that equation, those conversations that took place that decided how those people would live in dignity, we who are party to that conversation have shut ourselves down, and so we have not been able to influence our governments in ways that would stand them up to that conversation with the respect and show the respect that they should be showing. And so there is a picture of Chief Teresa Spence sitting on Parliament Hill, not alone, because there are many who are joining her there, but sitting there representing the tragedy and the horrific situation that her people in her particular community experience and communities across the country experience. Tomorrow morning, I'm getting together with Gail Smythe of Skills Canada and some others, and we are working, she's worked with the Board of Education, not the Board of Education, the Ministry of Education, and we're going to figure out how to get textbooks to the Aboriginal communities. That meeting is taking place tomorrow, but that they go without textbooks is a matter of our grave concern as treaty people. That's picture 1. Picture 2 is 16 6-year-olds and 4 7-year-olds, and the teachers that add their numbers up to 26 who were killed this past week in Connecticut. 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds who, while they may be able to have a conversation about significant things in their lives, have not yet reached the level of rational thought that would allow them to struggle with the concept of theodicy in any way that would have any respect in an academic hall, which is to say that their questions about suffering, the ones that we mostly put down very, very quickly, are significant questions, and we put them down quickly because we don't want to have to grapple with it, because we couldn't come up with an answer that would be able to withstand criticism in any academic hall. And picture 3 is a series of gruesome pictures that was brought to us this week by CTV, whose W5 exposed the conditions of a pork farm in Manitoba, a pork farm that was operating in ways that had pigs standing in gestational crates for almost all of their lives, that had piglets being castrated and having their tails cut off without benefit of anesthesia, that had animals being slaughtered in ways that didn't care whether or not they died immediately or whether they suffered indeterminately, and that showed employees of that farm jumping up and down on carcasses and making jokes about it. And may I remind you that those practices are acceptable practices in the pork farming industry in Canada. The farm where those films were taken was not targeted by the person who took them. It was merely one that he happened to be sent to as an employee. So how do these 3 things help us struggle with the idea of suffering in the world? They lend themselves to different parts of the argument. The first one lends itself to the argument of a veil of soul-making. John Hick, a process theologian back in the 1960s, went at the question of theodicy and came up with an understanding that saw the development of humans as a sort of 2-part story intertwined. He looked at the story of Genesis, that whole fall thing, and said it couldn't possibly be a literal story, that we didn't actually fall from grace at all, that the story was metaphorical, and he explained that Paul probably just didn't understand that, and so he took it literally. And I don't know that that's true either. But John Hick came up with this idea that humans do evolve. They evolve just the way any other animal in the world evolves. And so biologically, we are part of a pattern of evolution that is ongoing. At the same time, there's this thing called soul-making that's taking place, that we are growing into the perfection of God, that we are, through our interactions and our understandings and the things that we are exposed to in our life, we grow as humans, that unique part of us that is human. And that in our growing, we have to recognize that we haven't, as I said earlier, fallen from grace at all. We simply haven't yet attained it. And so, when humans participate in the kind of suffering that is ongoing and of which we are all aware in Attawapiskat and in the other Aboriginal communities of the world, not to name the thousands of other places that I neglected to give you the opportunity to mention this morning, but that we generally raise in our time of sharing in Syria and places all around the world, and groups that continue to experience oppression despite the fact that we know it's happening. All of that can be rationalized because we're just not there yet. We are incomplete humans. And our suffering is for our betterment. We will grow our souls in this veil of darkness and horror. Hick, of course, was chastised by responses, those who responded to his work by saying, but it's just not easy to say to somebody, you know, your suffering is going to make you a better person, which is basically what Hick's theodicy allowed him to say. Perhaps he had not suffered as much as Teresa Spence has suffered in her life. When we get to the concept of children who haven't yet attained that level of rational thought by which they could discern whether or not they were positively or negatively affected by what happened to them, if they couldn't participate in that language, there are theologians who dismiss their realities in the equation of suffering and evil. Because if we parse it carefully enough, if we take it apart and bring it down to the kinds of discussions that are so thick that they explain little to most and everything to the few, we get to the place where infant suffering, really, rather than 6- and 7-year-olds, but infant suffering can be explained because it's not really about God. If a child, an infant, can't rationally determine whether or not their lives would have been better if that act had not occurred to them, then it's not significant in that equation. Now, there's a whole lot of problems with that, and I'm sure, if you're not writing, it's because you know that I'm not actually articulating that as a theology. But that is a very significant argument in that ongoing discussion. But even if we could dismiss this because we haven't yet attained the perfection that would not allow us to let this happen, and even if we could dismiss this on some theological argument that takes away any kind of understanding on the part of the victim, we're stuck with this, and this is perhaps the most damning issue of all. Because there's not a single one of us who could watch the kind of animal suffering that takes place and hear those two human cries coming from those animals and tell anyone that they didn't know whether or not that was better for them or worse. It takes that sort of argument, which I considered a false argument, but you might buy it. It takes that false argument right out of it. And it puts the reality of suffering not only before us, but squarely in our own laps and our own hands. 2 or 3 years ago, that issue was brought to us at the board and as a congregation a year or so after the books study had looked at Pete Singer's book, Ethics of the Food We Eat, and it was placed before us, and what happened was what is going to happen now. What happened was that we were all so freaked out about the conversation that it got shut down before it happened. We couldn't have the conversation because we were all afraid that there was going to be I think I mentioned in my book, unless I cut this part, but people thought there was going to be the eating police running into your home and tearing that meat out of your freezer and making sure that your fingers were slapped every time you ordered something at McDonald's. In actual fact, we weren't going to do that. But if we want to seriously have this conversation, you should be doing it yourself. Because we can't talk about evil and we can't talk about suffering unless we take all three of those situations into consideration and we talk about our participation in it. Yesterday, my son posted a song on Facebook. It goes something like this. I was going to play it on YouTube, but I thought my rendition was pretty close. It's by a group called Sum 41, and it sounded like everything that blared out of the computer when he was living at home. He posted it, reflecting back that it may have some merit. Here are the words that are screamed out by those young boys in that video. Take everything left from me, all to blame. How can we still succeed taking what we don't need, telling lies, alibis, selling all the hate that we breed, supersize our tragedies, bought in the land of the free? And we're all to blame. We've gone too far, from pride to shame. We're trying so hard, we're dying in vain. We're hopelessly blissful and blind to all we are. We want it all with no sacrifice. Realize we spend our lives living in a culture of fear. Stand to salute, say thanks to the man of the year. How did we all come to this greed that we just can't resist? Tell me now, what have we done? We don't know. I can't allow what has begun to tear me down. Believe me now, we have no choice left. with our backs against the wall, and now we are all to blame. We've gone too far, from pride to shame. We're hopelessly blissful and blind, when all we need is something true to believe. Don't we all? Everyone, we will fall. Because we're all to blame. We've gone too far. Now, it's easy for us to write off a generation when they're screaming at us over the radio, but when we hear what comes from their hearts that they put out in that manner, it takes us back. And we have to think about these things of which we are a part. I don't want to diminish the pain in any of your lives. And I don't want to diminish what it is that you do to alleviate the pain in your life and in the lives of others. And I don't want to take away that this community is made up of extraordinary people that do extraordinary things on a day-to-day basis. But I cannot stand here and not say we are all to blame. Because whatever our day has brought, we are still complicit as part of that whole, when a part of that whole lives without peace. And here is where I invite you into the conversation. Because somehow we have to find a way that we can be bold enough to say to those who will look away from us when we open our mouths the truths that we have to speak. And we have to find the manner in which we can encourage those who will no longer look at us to hear what it is that we have to say, to recognize and be welcomed into a place they don't want to go, because it is a place of pain, a place of loss, a place where the world doesn't even look the same as it looked mere moments before. And we who are courageous enough to take apart our worldview, to take apart the picture of a God that kept us safe, to take apart the stories that helped us tell ourselves we were good. We who have the courage to do that must have the courage to speak truth where it is unwanted, desert or no, into which we might be cast. Because there is a very real emotional desert that exists out there for people who open their minds about these things. It's a very real desert, and people can die out there alone. And so I'm offering you these three pictures to help you see that even though we have walked beyond the understanding of a deity who can be explained in this way or this, but could never come up with an explanation for this, this one is now where we stand in relationship to them all. Because there is no being that we are trying to justify. There is no God that will make it all better in the eschaton, a time long in the future when John Hick believed everyone would be made perfect. Whether we believe in that or not, we are still complicit in the here and now and the suffering that goes on in our world. And the conversations that we have been too afraid to have in the past, we have to have, like it or no. And so I place that in your midst. And I ask you how we can have that conversation. I ask you how we can look at people in our own land that live without decent, clean water. And I ask you how we can talk about the things that we eat and how we really just want to keep on eating them without having to cope with the reality of that ugly stuff. And we have to talk about how children die in situations where they simply shouldn't die. There's an enormous problem with this style of church, and it is that I am up here and you are down there. And so the conversation is horribly one-sided most of the time. That's why I asked you to take notes, and that's why I asked you to participate. And I'm going to go and sit down now. And I want you to have a conversation. I've just been welcomed very graciously into the understanding presented by Mr. Stewart that the conversation has gone long enough. Thank you, Hal. But my guess is that the conversation has only started, in truth. And so I'm not going to take the time for you to share into the wider group what it is that you have talked about, though I think that those are probably very important conversations. Is there anyone who feels that it's really important that they share what took place in their conversation? I would encourage you to continue this conversation over coffee, and that we find a way to hold these conversations in this space, so that we can touch the world in a way that brings what we believe and what we value and what we hope for to fruition in a way that doesn't get it shut down and get us rejected and go the way of the Baptist, right? So I thank you for the honesty that you will have shared in your smaller groups, for your tenacity when it comes to the things you truly believe in, for the ways that your hearts have been broken, and so you have been called to live a more radicalized love in this world, and known the costs that brings you. And I pray that you may continue to speak in ways that touch hearts, and that your own heart is open to the words that touch it.